welcome to our very last panel of this ORIS 21. This panel is going to be about wiser governance measures, the role of non-governmental entities and non-traditional stakeholders in contributing to space security. And I'm delighted to be welcoming a fantastic panel. Let me very quickly introduce our wonderful panel. First of all, here in person, we have David Bertolotti. He is the Director of Institutional and International Affairs at EUTELSAT. Joining us online, we have Nobu Okada. He is the founder and CEO of Astroscale. We also have Abimbola Alale. She is the CEO of the Nigerian Communications Satellite Limited, or NECOMSAT. We also have Hui Du. He is the Senior Engineer at the Office of the President of the China Academy of Space Technology. We also have Jorge del Rio Vera. He is the Program Officer of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. And last but not least, we have Michael Newman. He is the Legal Officer of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs. Our moderator for this last panel, he is also here in person, is going to be Michael Spice. He is the Acting Head of Science and Technology Unit of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. So with that, I cede the floor to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Almudena, and to UNIDIR and the co-sponsors for organizing this event and inviting me to moderate this last panel. And thanks to everybody in the room and online for staying with us. So this last panel is meant to focus on engagement with the wider stakeholder community. This is sort of very welcome from our perspective at UNODA, as this is something that we've been committed to institutionally. Just to sort of briefly recap a couple points that the High Representative had made in her keynote remarks yesterday. On 10 September, the Secretary General released his report titled Our Common Agenda, which was pursuant to a request of the General Assembly in its resolution celebrating UN 75. And he had described outer space as one of several global commons beyond the jurisdiction of any one state, and he called for immediate actions to be pursued, including the elaboration of new instruments to prevent the weaponization of outer space. Towards this end, he called for a multi-stakeholder dialogue on outer space to take place as part of a Summit of the Future, which is to be convened in 2023. This multi-stakeholder dialogue would bring together governments, other leading space actors, and it could seek a high-level political agreement on developing a global regime to coordinate space traffic and on principles for the future governance of outer space activities. And so in this sense, we're very happy to be facilitating a discussion that is already involving multiple stakeholders, specifically on the topic of space security. In addition, under Action 12 of the Secretary General's 2018 Agenda for Disarmament, ODA and UNIDIR had committed to work together to facilitate the engagement of industry and other stakeholders in UN deliberations on space security as well. And so, again, this is very delighted to have this opportunity to continue to work together with our UNIDIR partners towards this end. As Almudena has already introduced our panelists, I would think without further ado, would just like to go in order and invite the panelists to provide some brief opening remarks on a set of general introductory topics, including on what they see from their perspective as non-governmental actors as the main security concerns, and how do they work to mitigate them. Do they feel that existing regulations aid in minimizing security concerns for industry actors, and what is helpful, what could be improved? what lessons could states learn from their practice as non-governmental or industry practitioners as they work to achieve the goal of the prevention of an arms race in outer space? And then finally, what sort of collaboration between states and industry, non-governmental actors do they see as the best way and moving us forward? So I would like to invite the panel briefly just to provide some opening reflections on these four broad themes, and then we will go into further depths and specifics before opening the floor to audience questions. So I'd first like to give the floor to David Bertolotti, who's here with us from EUTELSAT. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you also to UNIDIA for having me for this conference. It's really a pleasure to participate and also to see some of the participants for real for once. So very quickly, for those of you who may not know EUTELSAT, EUTELSAT is one of the leading global telecommunication satellite operators present both in the geostationary orbit with a fleet of approximately 40 spacecraft and now also in low Earth orbit through our recent investment in OneWeb, which we just finalized earlier this month. So the first thing I'd like to say is that quite obviously, but still it's important to say it, a peaceful use of outer space is a key objective for a private operator like EUTELSAT. We want to protect our assets, which are our investments, and so we have no particular interest, on the contrary, to conflict developing into outer space. Nonetheless, we observe developments and we see some of the threats. And I'd say that to answer one of the questions, our concerns are threefold. The first concern is jamming. That's not particularly new. That's actually the most common form of hostile act against satellites, and it's also quite cheap and accessible for hostile actors. The second one is clearly cyber. We see that as one of the most likely risks in the future across the spectrum of capabilities, both in space and on the ground for the ground segment of the satellite. And the third is the intentional creation of debris, which would have, as we all know, catastrophic consequences, not just for the operator concerned, but for the whole ecosystem. But as you can see, none of those three risks really are in outer space. And so the notion on which the sort of disarmament community continues to discuss sometimes of PAROS is to us a little bit off mark, or at least you would have to rename it. It's prevention of arms race about outer space or around outer space, but not necessarily in space. And interestingly also, two of these three risks can be addressed in other fora than pure security ones. Jamming is usually dealt with at ITU across the square over there, and cyber, well, there's a host of fora in which norms of standards or best practices are being developed, and that's actually why EUTELSAT has decided to sign up to the Paris Call for Trust and Security in cyberspace, because we really need to be very clear about the fact that those two spaces, outer space and cyberspace, are a continuum in the digital world, in the business we are in, which is the business of connectivity. And there's a need for a multi-stakeholder approach. So to go to your next question, yes, we do believe in the importance of collaboration between state and non-state actors. We are today in a reality that is very different from the one that existed at the time of the Outer Space Treaty negotiation, with constellations, in particular commercial fleets, will vastly outnumber state assets. And so it's very important to have a partnership, trusted partnership, as we say in France, partenariat de confiance, with government authorities. By the way, that works even better when you have a national space law that governs those relationships. And you've been asking about, the tools or the legal instruments that can facilitate the conversation. Well, I have to note that, unfortunately, even within the EU or the European space, not all states today have a national space law. So it also starts there. And to mention another topic, which was the subject of the previous panel, which I found absolutely fascinating, private actors can also clearly play a role in SSA. One of the speakers said that SSA basically had to be ways for space. Well, we are a WASA, and actually quite a pretty big one, because we have a lot of moving parts up there, and so we can input things into an SSA systems, and maybe also in the future we could see things, provided we have the right capacity on the new satellites that we launch. The reality is also that we are dual use, maybe not by nature, but certainly by the virtue of how the market functions today. And I felt yesterday that there was maybe a suggestion that if operators would not discriminate between civil and military activities, well, it was too bad for them. They would become fair game in a conflict. I don't think that, first of all, it should happen, but I don't think it's also a reality of market dynamics, because government services for private operators like us in the telecom business, they are a reality, because simply put, we are in infrastructure. And you don't ask a power plant or a railway station to declare whether it's civilian or military. We power the digital world. Armies need digital connectivity, whether for the welfare of their soldiers or for war-fighting capabilities. So inevitably, we also power the digital transformation of armies. But does it justify creating catastrophic consequences in outer space? Well, clearly, I don't think so. But the consequence of this, and I'll finish there, is certainly a need for transparency about defense space policies, because the problem in our view is not so much that some countries have a space defense policy, but rather that some countries with capabilities are not clear or not transparent about what they intend to do with them. And what they would be prepared to do in outer space, in which circumstances, and with what sort of boundaries. And so while I know that military people like the surprise effects, we business people like predictability. And I think predictability and transparency were two words that came back pretty often in those 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for those introductory remarks. And yes, a couple of themes that I would like to follow up on later. But first, let's continue down. Next, I'd like to turn to Dr. Alale to provide some of her preliminary thoughts on these topics. Dr. Alale, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michael. Let me join David to appreciate UNIDRIL in organizing this all very important conversation around space security. David has already spoken a lot about what operators like NIGCOMSAT expect. Most of the things they said concerning our security concerns are very true for both non-governmental and governmental actors, and how we work to mitigate. And there was something interesting that you said. Yes, ITU takes care of jamming, but during the last part of David's opening remarks, you also said something about the fact that some big actors in space do not actually cooperate or feel the need to actually coordinate with smaller players of outer space, the smaller users like NIGCOMSAT or any other organization that are not as big as those big actors. Why I'm not going to name them for the purpose of of discussion, but it's a real issue that we need the big space actors to be more transparent, because that is going to ensure that the purpose of what Unigel is pursuing with PAROS is achieved, because transparency and predictability is very good for business. And that actually ensures security, because when you're talking of security, you're talking of either operational security, you're talking of financial security. And so everything boils down to, sustainability of the use of outer space. And so those concerns, I believe at the end of this discussion, we'll be able to come up with modalities for UNIRE and PAROS agenda to tailor some policies towards resolving or tackling or, dealing with the big space, high-stake big space actors, whether they're states or they're non-states. But I feel because they're very big, they do not feel the need to be transparent enough. Yes, they use military reasons, they use several reasons. However, I think at the end of this discussion, this PAROS agenda will be able to come up with even modalities to guide those very secretive or very military or very, exclusive or confidential agenda that they do not share information, and therefore put other smaller operators at risk, because information is needed for everyone to be able to coordinate its businesses around the space, so that we can guide against our operations, and we can all become responsible space actors and users. Well, some of the license from non-governmental entities, are they going to be able to achieve PAROS agenda? We see, many of them, I think some of the things have been very useful, but we could do better. And of course, there is nothing more that I personally, and on the part of operators, ISOA, and everybody who has been active participants in all this space security, we always preach collaboration, because I believe having, using SSA and having a collaborative, team spirit will guide and actually give all of us a more secured outer space. And for us to have a sustainable outer space, I think this sort of forum, which UNIDRA is organizing, it's more than adequate. And on this note, I do believe everybody, by the time you hear from everybody, people like Nobu, who are, defining different models to guide operations, who are, neutral space actors, I believe all the people you have put together to come to discuss this at this conference, we'll be able to get one or two things from everybody, and we guide us to be able to have actually a sustainable and secure use of outer space.
Thank you so much for your opening remarks, and already it's interesting to see the commonalities from the perspective of both a large operator and a small operator in terms of the importance of transparency in particular, and data sharing, and so I think we can come back to that theme perhaps later. Next, I'd like to turn to Hui Du from the China Academy of Space Technology. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Michael. It's a great pleasure to join the panel. I share some of the points of the previous panelists, but as a satellite manufacturer, I have some different opinions. First, I would say that the primary role of space security resides in states where non-governmental entities can only play a secondary role. The situation is rapidly changing because different kinds of non-governmental entities have already begun to own space assets and thus have become stakeholders. Thus, that makes non-government entities' role as a stakeholder in space security increasingly important. Of course, we know that The activities of non-governmental entities have already brought a lot of benefits to the humanity, but there are also some general concerns. First, the number of space objects launched into outer space by non-governmental entities, especially by mega constellation owners, is increasing exponentially, which will make the probability of clearing space increase very much. The second, new space systems such as space debris removal and in-orbit service systems are dual use and can be easily converted into space weapons. And while non-government entities' contribution to space capacity building is very important, they may also proliferate space technologies very critical to space weapons. Based on that, activities of non-governmental entities have the potential of worsening global space security situation and may even contribute to arms race in outer space. Compliance with existing regulations is not enough. Social responsibilities should be considered seriously by non-government entities. Non-government entities should be transparent and cooperative. Information about the activities and the space objects should be shared, and they should be responsive and cooperative when any situation arises. And since activities of non-government entities may touch frontiers where rules are absent or inadequate, non-government entities should work in a positive way by implementing high technical standards in maintaining space environment. As for the engagement in international rules-making processes, non-government entities are already very active in contributing to rules-making processes concerning the long-term sustainability of outer space activities, exploration and utilization of space resources, radio regulations, and so on. But since PAROS is mainly about national security and very complicated and sensitive, it's better to keep rules-making power in the hands of states. Non-government entities can provide documents to the process. As an established practice, the documents will be used as references. In this way, non-government entities can contribute to PAROS rules-making, and we can move forward. Actually, still I have to emphasize that there are a lot of things we can learn from non-government entities in regard of space security. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much for your introductory remarks, and also, from bringing to us the perspective of a manufacturer. And so, we'll definitely look forward to kind of drilling down further into what you can sort of bring from your unique perspective. But I think a couple of the points that you raised, especially on the increasing challenges of objects in orbit, debris removal, and dual-use technology, is a perfect segue to our next speaker, Mr. Nobu Okada. Can, I think, provide his very unique perspective on these issues. So, Mr. Okada, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you for this panel and this critical discussion. I think this panel itself shows our international commitment to space safety and sustainability. And we all agree how important to tackle space environmental issue is. So I appreciate you having me here today. For those who don't know Astroscale, Astroscale is the first private company with a vision to secure the safe and sustainable development of space for the benefit of the future generations, and the only company dedicated to on-orbit servicing across all orbit. We are always committed to space safety and sustainability, and then we are always transparent from the beginning, and which is just echoing what the previous three panelists said. Outer space is a unique domain. Unlike air, land, sea, there are no national borders. Instead, all the actors, like military, civilian, and the commercial actors, are sharing the same orbital highway. Until recently, states have played key roles, but now commercial actors have more assets than governments. For these reasons, commercial stakeholders need to be part of conversation for space safety and sustainability. So that's why I really appreciate today's panel. And then there are values of bringing in commercial players. Commercial industry is already working globally and internationally, regardless of states' affiliation. Commercial actors think about not only short-term interest, but also long-term interest, because we are doing business. We all agree space environment is at risk due to space debris. So we all care about space sustainability. Therefore, engaging commercial actors could share best practices, promote dialogues, international cooperation, and coordination among various actors, and then increase trust among actors. In short, I appreciate today's agenda and objective, and commercial stakeholders need to be key players in bringing in solutions for space safety and sustainability. That's my initial remark. Thank you. Turn back to Michael.
Thank you so much, and I look forward to deepening this conversation later on precisely how we can facilitate this kind of engagement. But next, I want to turn to the final introductory statement, which will be by Dr. Jorge del Rio Vera from the Office for Outer Space Affairs. You have the floor.
I'd like to start thanking you, and Almudena for the organization of this panel. And really appreciating to be here. And it's already been two very exciting days. So I work as Michael was mentioning, I'm working in the Office for Outer Space Affairs, and I'm going to come from a completely different angle of what has been mentioned before. I'm coordinating a program that is called Access to Space for All, which is basically a technology induction program. What we are trying to do with this program, with Access to Space for All, is to provide opportunities to countries that don't have access to research facilities or infrastructure to develop space capabilities, and indigenously. And this is really, really important in order to actually develop sustainable and responsible behavior. We are doing this program in cooperation with industry, space agencies, and research institutions. So it's kind of very multilateral cooperation. And what we are trying to do is to incorporate responsible behavior into the hands-on opportunities that we are providing. For instance, we have an opportunity with JAXA for countries to be able to deliver a 1 EUTELSAT into space. What we are asking the applicants when they are submitting an application to the program is to incorporate the compliance to space debris mitigation guidelines and to long-term sustainability, to the guidelines of on long-term sustainability of outer space activities when applicable. And we have to bear in mind that space is more and more accessible by many different actors. And for actors to behave responsibly, they have to have access to technology. And I concur with previous speakers. Space technology is dual use, and there are difficulties there. The program that we have put together, it's an entry level program. So the kind of technologies and capabilities are not that advanced, but still they can be considered again. Dual use, we are doing it for peaceful uses only, and whoever is applying to these opportunities is committing to peaceful uses of outer space. But it is important that we are including everybody in the discussion, and we are including also the perspective of those who have not been able to access space and to develop that technology, to give them the tools and the opportunities to develop technology that then it can be used in a responsible and sustainable manner. And that's what we are trying to do with this program in the office. Private actors are very important. We are partnering with private actors to develop those opportunities. We are also partnering with space agencies and with research institutions. So it's as I was mentioning in the beginning, it's a multilateral program which is already delivering very successful results. We are seeing those best practices and guidelines implemented by the countries that are applying and utilizing these opportunities. So I would like to launch also that that view of integrating into the security discussion and in the discussion that we are having here today, that we cannot forget capacity building and giving the possibility for those who have not been able to develop the technology yet to have means to develop that technology, because at the end, space, as the Outer Space Treaty is mentioning, is the province of humankind. Thank you, and over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Jorge, for providing us with these sort of examples of very concrete cooperation and the role that international institutions can play in cooperating with different types of actors, especially around the areas of dual-use technology. So now I'd like to come back for maybe more of an interactive segment, going back over some of the main themes and going a little bit deeper. First, starting with kind of, we have published this year the report of the Secretary General pursuant to Resolution 7536, which focused on the perceptions of states. A number of non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations also presented their views on the topics addressed in that resolution. But here I'd like to take this opportunity to sort of hear a little bit more from the industry perspective on these security challenges. These were touched upon in some of the introductory remarks, but maybe tying some of the themes together from across this past day. I want to start with David and kind of your sense. You did speak on the one hand of how military targeting is not such a kind of a concern of an actor such as yourself because of the reality of commercial space and critical infrastructure being so important. Nonetheless, as states continue to develop capabilities that could conceivably interfere with, deny, disrupt, degrade, damage, or destroy space systems. Is your perception of these threats kind of changing? Are there kind of different types of challenges or risks that you perceive in the future, or do the main challenges that you have described, jamming, cyber, and debris, pretty much remain kind of as they might have been, a decade ago? And then, as a second part. In an earlier panel, there was sort of this interesting comment made about just sort of the nature of, I guess, the speculation on how international humanitarian law might apply to let's see, states with capabilities to attack targets in space, and this challenge of dual use in that context. If you have customers who are military or civilians, there is some scenarios in which your asset might be regarded as a legitimate military objective, and of course that has to get balanced against, like, I think what you were describing, this notion of critical infrastructure and the dire consequences of sort of an attack against those systems. And I would just be really curious to hear your perspective on that point of view, and if that's something that you think about.
Thank you, Michael. Now on threats, perhaps to refine a little bit what I said earlier. I think that in the past years, the interesting thing is that the conversation has led to, I think, clear realization that debris generation operations, in other words, kinetic activities, would be extremely dangerous and detrimental to the whole community and well, to mankind, to use the words of the Outer Space Treaty. Obviously, not to the point of allowing for a proper treaty on this to be accepted and negotiated, nor perhaps to the point of countries completely giving up on developing those types of weapons, but at least the conversation has been useful in focusing attention and having a lot of people in policy circles and elsewhere realizing that the danger and basically, I think today, whoever does this exposes itself considerably. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot of other activities that are not of concern to us or are not dangerous. There are more subtle ways to attack and degrade satellite capabilities. But typically, I mentioned cyber, and actually within cyber, there are lots of types of attacks. On the ground segments, on the space systems, you have what is called spoofing, so sort of altering the nature of the signal, which is probably halfway cyber, halfway something of itself. But that also has huge operational consequences. Also, I mean, not necessarily in the kinetic domain, but everything that has to do with proximity operations to collect intelligence about what a satellite does and does not do. These are things of great concern. And actually, I mean, rendezvous operations or close proximity operations are, I think, a good transition to your other question about dual use, because it's very clear. I mean, we know that there are some national assets trying to look at our commercial satellites just to identify what's going through them and maybe identify, encrypted communications compared to normal communication, different types of encryption on the same satellite. So we already know that we are exposed by the dual-use nature of our activities. But the first thing I'd like to note is that, I mean, we don't see a problem in itself of supporting government customers. I mean, we support, we support peacekeeping operations, we support training missions, we support the welfare of soldiers who are deployed but not necessarily in operations. So there's already a whole range of support to military activities that are absolutely not problematic in themselves. And even when you move to the realm of operations, again, I think that the traditional balance and the proportionality criterion would still apply, and the catastrophic consequences of completely degrading the functionality of a satellite has to be taken into account. And once again, I mean, a satellite by a commercial operator is not fair game just because that operator has percentage X of its activities dedicated to government services. At least this is a quite firmly held view on our part. But we are concerned that this conversation is developing and that some may argue that it's not just the pure military satellites that are susceptible to targeting. And of course, with constellations now coming into play, this is even more of a concern.
Okay, thank you for that, and for making that attempt at a very challenging topic. I think it also points to the importance of being able to have more of a frank and open discussion around this question of IHL and the consequences, which I think is very much an understudied topic. Next, I would like to, sticking on this sort of theme of security concerns and challenges, I want to turn to Dr. Alale, and from the perspective of a small operator, if you can maybe elaborate on what you see as some of the particular consequences that you would face from your perspective of certain high-risk activities to your operations, and really what do you see as sort of the consequences from your perspective and in terms of risk that you might face.
We all know, we are aware, and this is one of the reasons why you are calling for this conversation, is because space is now becoming more and more congested. We have constellations, we have satellites of different sizes, types, for different reasons. So it's becoming more and more congested. And of course, you're calling for safety of space operations and the safety use. However, ITU, we know that ITU has put in place some processes for coordination. The outer space treaties that guide us, irrespective of that, in case we have any irresponsible space actor or space user, there are differences that a small operator like NIGCOMSAT could face. You talk of losses, of different kind of losses, loss of revenues, loss of equipment, which could be space equipment, which could be ground equipment. And then you talk of, even if that happens, you talk of, we're talking of SA, gathering information to support space situational awareness. How do you gather? If I stop my operation, how do I support that aspect, that call for contributing data to space operations? You lose data from a small operator if such things happen. Then again, you talk of the workforce, the effect on the workforce. If I lose my operations, that means I can't, even salaries, I may lose them. So there are different risks, different human, you look at engineering risk, you look at that's technical risk, you look at humanity risk, you look at different things. So I think in order not to get to this point where an operator will have to lose service, we have to lose this position, and the trust of customers, I think there is need for us to talk more about this responsible space, behavior. And I think you really need to lay more emphasis on acts, regardless of how big they are. It's our use of space, and make sure that we have coordinated, close operation and approaches to things. I think this conversation, we really need to define the way forward for operators and users of outer space. Thank you. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move on to the existing governance environment around space activities, and in particular, if we could hear from some of our panelists on their views from their own perspectives on whether sufficient rules exist, and this kind of question of binding rules or non-binding regulations. From your perspective, what do you see as sort of the way forward, and what would actually would be sufficient to mitigate the risks as you've laid them out? And so I think first I would like to turn to Mr. Hui Du from your perspective on the development of the governance regime.
I think this question is very difficult to answer because there should be a balance. I think generally speaking, I think industry actors are willing to support the development of new legally binding rules at international level as long as it's necessary. And because many are very concerned about the worsening of space environment, and in order to make the space environment sustainable and available for future generations, we should make some legally binding rules such as prevention of arms race in outer space, so that we can set some bottom lines to maintain the availability of outer space to all humanity. However, since rules what comes with together with the rules are costs. So we should be very rational and should be very careful in making new rules. And also we should keep in mind that, as Jorge has already mentioned, that there are still a lot of developing countries who are not having any space assets, and they are going to build their space capacity, and they want to access space. So we should also make sure new legally binding rules will not prevent non-spacefaring countries, especially developing countries, from entering into outer space. by setting high barriers. That's my point. Thank you, Michael.
I think that's an important point that hasn't come up so far in this discussion, this notion of how to design a response to security challenges in a way that doesn't impede development. It's a very important consideration. I'd like to go to Mr. Okada next, and to talk a little bit more about the sort of notion that we've had some perspectives about the way that different types of measures can build up, going from non-binding measures and then how those can form the basis for legal principles. This is an important concept that's captured in the 2013 report on TCBMs, but this is looking at state behavior. Would like to hear your perspective from an industry perspective on what are the kinds of measures that industry actors can do cooperating among themselves that could feed into measures that could even potentially be taken up by states. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. First of all, let me briefly, touch on the dual-use technologies. So basically, all the space technologies are dual-use: launch vehicle, Earth observation, runnable capability, whatever. So that's why transparency really matters. So using our example, Astroscale, disclosure mission, you can look at our SNS website, and then we get license from a state, and then in a country we not we abide by the kind of the domestic rules, and then we're always transparent. So that's the only way to avoid argument. And then talking about kind of measures, I always have analogies. So think about highway, road on the Earth. When the number of the cars increased, we never asked the drivers stop driving. Instead, we developed traffic laws and traffic monitoring system and road service. So when there's a defunct car, the road service will tow the car. So I think same type of kind of a framework is needed in space. So this is space traffic management. We need normal behaviors, and then we need SSA, coordinated SSA, and on-orbit servicing to make sure orbit highway have a flow, continued flow. And then this is the only way to make balance between development and environment, which is sustainability. So that's my perspectives. And then commercial players are playing a key role on this. And then let me add one more comment, how commercial players are trying to develop best practices. So commercial industry is developing kind of trade association or group to come up with best practices. So for example, CONFIRST is discussing about best practices of satellite servicing. And then SSC is discussing about how to play a responsible behavior in space and gather together and come up with kind of joint kind of rules, and then industry just obey these internal rules. So actually the government can listen and refer and adopt, if it makes sense, these kind of best practices, and gradually develops the kind of rules in practice. So again, I believe it's not just a government and the states. It's kind of a joint work of the governments and commercial entities and other groups, and join together and develop the rules. That's my thought. Turn over to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you for those perspectives, both on how a private actor can demonstrate that they are a responsible actor, but also how you can work together with other entities to actually form your own best practices in the absence of regulation at the international level. Let's see. So Jorge has also asked to come in and respond to this question. So Jorge, you have the floor.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Actually, I wanted to pick up on the example that Nobu was putting forward, which is the roads and the cars. And yeah, you need good roads. You need you are not asking the cars to stop, and you are putting legislation together. But also another thing that you don't want to have is that the other cars don't have the same or similar safety measures that you have. If you are the only car that has an ABS brake, I mean, and the others don't, you still have problems. So I would like to bring again to the discussion the need for including technology and technology transfer or technology development programs into the discussion, because they are definitely needed and part of it. Thank you. Over.
Okay, thanks so much, Jorge. Is the final set of questions from me before we open up to general discussion. I really want to ask each of the panelists about what they see as sort of the best mode for first, really, these issues of international security. We heard the perspective from one of the panelists already that when we're dealing with international security, these are matters for the state and for state decision making. Nonetheless, we've heard other perspectives that there is a tremendous interest from commercial actors in being part of the conversation. They see themselves as critical stakeholders. And so this question of how to sort of optimally engage. And so I would just like to kind of, to wrap up this mode of the panel, just to go back over and just kind of hear from the perspective of the panelists about, how they prefer to engage, what is sort of a useful way of sort of cooperating in this sort of process of developing the international governance around space security questions. I'd like to start with, again, with David.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that certainly as a private actor, we don't dispute the fact that ultimately it's up to governments to set the rules. In as much as it was recalled yesterday, I think, and as many of you as specialists know, the responsibility regime in outer space is so different that, of course, states continue to bear a very special responsibility. But so the only thing that we then see as important is to be able to have that conversation with, first of all, national authorities in our case, but as I said earlier, we're fortunate enough to have a national legal framework that caters for this. Increasingly, it's our view that this conversation has to be at the European level, which is, I would say, in terms of critical mass, the most relevant framework. But also, of course, ultimately, that has to be done internationally, because this is perhaps where I would take a slightly different position today as a representative of the private sector than I would have as a diplomat years ago. We like, in the private sector, I think we like the level playing field. And so we like rules to be identical or very similar for everyone. If we operate in a sort of an island of good behavior, which would be the European Union, when everybody else is not behaving, I'm not saying that's the case today, but let's assume, we haven't really solved our problem. So at some point, we have to find a way also to associate to that conversation the relevant players at a global level. Actually, some UN bodies have done that beautifully for decades, and that's typically in our sector. It's the case of the ITU, where under the Constitution, private operators are intrinsically part of the conversation. So I don't see why that couldn't be replicated when we start a new conversation for outer space in the 21st century on security matters.
Thank you so much. So next, would like to ask Dr. Lale if you'd like to speak to this.
Yeah, I jotted down my points when Nobu was talking, but unfortunately, David actually pointed out that, because I was actually thinking that if we are to have this conversation, UNIDRIL and other stakeholders will really need to be very active roles, because private actors are all subjected to national regulations. Yes, some international regulations like the ITU, and those national regulations concerning space activities actually rely mostly on OST. So I'm just thinking of how we can all come together and, like, yes, nothing is impossible if we put our minds to it, and if we make everybody realize the importance of this, that is actually is for the good of mankind. If we all try to use space responsibly and safety, and of course sustainable use of outer space for our good, our common good. But I think we need to let the national regulators, welcome opinions from private and commercial actors, because governments rely on these commercial actors for revenue. So the government must also create an enabling environment for them to perform and, perform their functions that we make them, open more doors and listen to the private actors on what they think is the way forward, what are their processes. But I think really, let me tell you something that I think I will find that I would suggest that going forward we need to look at. Maybe since most of the existing rules center around, just policy direction, OSN and all that, I think going forward, we should specifically focus on rules guiding space project execution, operational procedures, problem resolution procedures, and where to mitigate any risk that may have been identified, and so that around the policy formulation. So I think we need to be more specific, things to guide most of our operation, because right now everybody just say, okay, this is OST, you do this, you do that. But I think specifically different projects, that's why I mentioned the word space project execution. The processes we have to have like a documented, procedure for anybody that wants to operate in space to follow. I think that would actually, guide the private actors more, and even government to begin to realize. So we need to have, let me just say in summary, new ways of thinking, and government must be open to what the private sector has to say. And I don't know who better to coordinate this than UNIDRE, UNOSA, and all your partners in driving this forward. Because if you leave it to just the nations to go to come around and do this conversation, to never happen. So somebody needs to be responsible for coordinating these talks and this discussion. It may take us a while, but I think eventually you are going to achieve the PAROS agenda if we are very consistent and very committed. Those are my thoughts. Michael, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I think those are good points. Yeah, certainly there's an important responsibility on national entities, governments cooperating in their own sector, but certainly the UN entities can also play a supporting role as well. Next, I want to go to Hui Du. You have the floor.
Non-government entities should work very closely with governments, and that's very good for both sides, because laws are based on practices, and industry sectors can provide very valuable practices for governments, and they can share their experiences in implementing measures, and also they can make recommendations to the governments on how to make the rules more and make rules more applicable to industry actors. And that will be very, very useful for governments and also for industry actors, because it will make the governments very confident in making new laws, in making new rules, and because in doing this, that they can make sure that it will be applicable to industry actors, and it will not be too much for industry actors. And at the international level, since the governments know how the industries can accept and they know the practices of industry actors, they'll be very confident in making new international rules, and it's easier for them to reach consensus in international platforms. And at international platforms, there are already a lot of different ways for non-governmental entities to participate in the international rules-making processes. And they can provide advice, they can provide reference documents, and it's not necessary to participate directly in the consultations. And since we know, as Dr. Ananya has already mentioned, that the OST, Article 6 of OST has already mentioned that non-governmental entities, the activities of non-government entities are subject to supervision and authorization of governments. So it's better to leave the rules-making power in the hands of states, and non-government entities can choose a lot of different other ways to contribute to the processes. So in a word, I think that it's very important to work for non-government entities to work closely with governments. That's very beneficial for both sides. That's all. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, thank you for your perspective on that. And next, I'd like to go to Nobu on the same question of engagement between private actors and intergovernmental processes.
I think Abimbola mentioned a very important topic, so OST. So it is a state responsibility under the article OST to monitor and supervise activities by private sectors, and activities should be conducted as licensed. So you're right. So, the government should understand what kind of best practices are evolved in day by day, and then industry should inform the government what kind of technological advancement, what kind of concerns, what kind of best practices are developed day by day. So again, it's not one stakeholder who can set up the kind of measures or rules. It's a multi-stakeholders. Multi-stakeholders should discuss more. And then I see the proliferation of the discussion of space safety and sustainability at domestic level, at industry level, at international organization level, and at academia level. So let's continue multi-stakeholder discussions. This is the only way to get to the best practices and then make a rule in the end. So again, that's why I believe today's panel is very, very important, and I really appreciate this. Over to Michael.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I think there are a diversity of actors represented on this panel and a diversity of perspectives on this topic. I think these are all very important contributions. So there's a question from online from our panelist from a previous session, Goyu Wang, who would like to ask a question. I understand that he can actually come on and pose that question himself. So I would like to give the floor to Goyu.
Thank you so much, Michael, for the floor. Thank you for all the panelists for the very interesting points. And if I may, I would like to ask one question to Debbie. So if I get you correctly, you mentioned that proportion principle is applicable in the scenario of space conflicts. But we know that it's still very uncertain about the applicability of a proportion principle, no matter in the law of use of force or HL, because the use of kinetic weapons to excite self-defense in space would inevitably generate a amount of space debris. It is hard to be subject to either proportion principle. So do you think that a state should be deprived the right of self-defense and the right in war if it has no other effective means to do so? And another question, allow me to Mr. Okada. You just thank you for the, you raised a very interesting example about the traffic control on road to support, the norms of responsible behavior initiative. So do you think that the establishment of space traffic governance or coordination system is a proper target of PAROS? Or do you think that PAROS is more suitable to discuss STM or STC than that in COPUOS? Or whether you think that this initiative is suitable to cover the STM subject? So maybe do you think it's suitable to discuss this initiative in COPUOS? Thank you.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, space or international lawyer, so I'll not necessarily argue on that point, and I would certainly not argue in a security context that the right to self-defense cannot be exercised. But what I was trying to say is that really, if I look at the business we are in, which is satellite telecommunication, as I said, we are an infrastructure. And it's true, it's not necessarily always prohibited to target an infrastructure. I mean, you can destroy a bridge if it has military value, if it has a certain military impact. But I think in the case of space, what people are now realizing, especially in LEO, but that's true at the end of the day of all orbits, that it's a little bit as if by destroying one bridge, you're having all the other bridges on the same river downstream collapsing as well, and a flood being generated on top of that, and all around it being destroyed. That's about the impact that a kinetic activity in space would have. So what I was trying to say is that I think that the gradual awareness of those effects is steering the conversation in a way towards better assessing what is responsible and what is not. And again, I'm not saying that we would like to be targeted by milder ways of attack than others, but there are certainly some means that have disproportionate impact, and that has to be realized. That there are just things that today, even more than before, are simply irresponsible. I think that was just my point.
Thank you for that. Next, I'd like to turn to Nobu for the question directed at him.
Thank you very much for the interesting question. And your question is about where it's appropriate organization to discuss space traffic management. And then, to be honest, it's interesting, but I don't have the answer. What I know is, the STM is discussed in various places. At academia level, IAF, IAA, AIAA, and at the domestic country level, and then more bilateral level, and then in various ways. So what I welcome is I see the proliferation of the discussion of STM, and then this is important. As a private sector, what we can do is we know technologies, we know what we can do, we know what is feasible in space. So regulations and technology should come together without knowing what we can do, we cannot have a proper regulations. So we will try our best to inform the all the kind of stakeholders, and then very honestly. So sorry about that. I'm not the appropriate person to answer this question because I'm not legal expert or nor arms control expert. But there's a way, there's a role as a commercial company to contribute to the STM. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I understand that we are now coming to the end of our time, and that we will need to wrap up in this room by 6 p.m. sharp. So unless there are any final comments, I think I would just like to thank all of the panelists for participating and for sharing their diverse perspectives with us. I think this has been very useful exchange, and look forward to looking for new different ways in the future of engaging different stakeholders in these processes.